So this all happened in the dead of night. A surgical strike that basically took out an entire government and completely redrew the map of power in the Western Hemisphere. This is a story of Operation Southern Spear, a mission that has, and this is no exaggeration, just changed everything. Let's break down exactly how it happened. Okay, so picture this. It's 2 in the morning in Caracas. Suddenly, the entire city goes dark. A few coordinated explosions rock the capital, hitting key power stations and air defense sites. People hear helicopters flying low and fast, but honestly, by the time anyone could figure out what was going on, it was already over. And the results? Absolutely stunning. In a raid that was over in minutes, U.S. Special Forces grabbed President Nicolás Maduro and the First Lady, and get this, they weren't taken to some local base. No, they were immediately flown out to a U.S. warship sitting in international waters. The official reason? Federal charges for narco-terrorism. And then came the real bombshell. The U.S. announced it was taking temporary, direct administrative control of Venezuela. Right, so the huge question on everyone's mind is, how is this even possible? This wasn't a full-on invasion like we've seen in the past. It was something else entirely. A precision strike, really, that was years in the making and executed with overwhelming force from both the sea and the sky. But you know, a raid like this doesn't just happen out of the blue. If you look at the timeline, it was really the final move in a 4-month-long chess game of escalation. It started small, with the U.S. Navy picking off suspected drug boats. Then it ramped up to a full naval quarantine, blocking Venezuelan oil. And then, just days before the main event, a CIA drone hits Venezuelan soil. You see the pattern? Each step was designed to normalize the next one. 2 key pieces of hardware made this whole thing possible. First, you have the aircraft carrier USS Gerald R. Ford. Its job was to create a total screen of air power and electronic warfare, basically blinding and deafening any Venezuelan defenses. At the same time, you had the USS Iwo Jima, an amphibious assault ship, which acted as the floating launch pad for the special forces. And, just as important, the floating prison to hold Maduro. The raid itself was just a masterclass in modern warfare. Step 1, paralyze the enemy by taking out their eyes and ears. Step 2, send in the elite Delta Force on stealth helicopters. Apparently, Maduro ran to a fortified panic room, but it didn't matter. The operators just used breaching charges to blow the steel doors right off. The whole thing was what you'd call a bum rush. They were in and out before any loyalist forces could even figure out what was happening. But how did they know exactly where he was, down to the very room? Well, that kind of pinpoint precision screams one thing. They had help from the inside. A high-level CIA asset deep within the Maduro government was feeding U.S. forces his real-time location. They turned his fortress into a trap. Now let's zoom out a bit, because this operation was never just about capturing one man. It was really about the public unveiling of a radical new American foreign policy, a complete rewrite of the rulebook for America's own backyard. So what was the legal key that unlocked this whole thing? It all came down to the charge of narco-terrorism. See, by indicting Maduro not as a head of state, but as the leader of a massive criminal enterprise, the U.S. Justice Department could argue that he didn't have sovereign immunity. In their eyes, he wasn't a president, he was just a fugitive from the law. And this is where it gets truly wild and completely unprecedented. Instead of handing power over to the Venezuelan opposition, President Trump went on TV and said, quote, "We are going to run the country." Just think about that. This isn't about propping up a friendly government anymore. This is direct U.S. administration. And that, right there, is the core of this new Donroe Doctrine. You know, the old Monroe Doctrine from the 1800s was defensive. It basically told Europe to stay out of the Americas. This new doctrine? Well, it's the exact opposite. It's aggressive, it's interventionist. It says the U.S. won't just intervene. It will step in, seize assets, and basically put a failed state into administrative receivership, like a bankrupt company. To really get how much of a game changer this is, just look at the last time the U.S. did anything even remotely similar, the 1989 invasion of Panama. That was a huge ground invasion with almost 30,000 troops, and when it was over, power was handed to Panamanians. Operation Southern Spear, a quick, surgical raid that ends with a U.S. military governor running the show. And it's all happening in a world where rivals like China and Russia have huge investments in Venezuela. The stakes are just exponentially higher. And yeah, those higher stakes became obvious almost immediately as the news broke. The shockwaves from this didn't just rattle the Caribbean. They hit stock exchanges in London and foreign ministries in Beijing and Moscow. The very first place you saw the reaction was, of course, the energy markets. Oil prices shot up nearly 9% overnight. And the fear wasn't even about Venezuela's current production, which is pretty low. No, it was about the instability, the risk of sabotage, and what this aggressive new U.S. posture means for the rest of the world's energy supply. For the world's major powers, the stakes are just enormous. For Russia, it's a public humiliation. Their prized advanced air defense systems in Venezuela, totally useless. And they lost their main strategic partner in the Americas. For China, it's a potential financial catastrophe, with over $60 billion in loans basically up in smoke. And then you have a rising power like India, stuck in a really tough spot since they've become hugely dependent on the very Venezuelan oil that the U.S. now controls. So look, the raid itself was a wild success. But the mission? It's far from over. Capturing Maduro was just the opening move. Now comes the really hard part. What to do next? And that brings us to the two very different, very possible futures for Venezuela. So this is the real question now, isn't it? With Maduro gone, what actually happens on the ground? I mean, taking out the leader is one thing. Trying to control a country of 28 million people is a completely different ballgame. And really, it boils down to two nightmare scenarios for the U.S. On the one hand, you have the very real threat of a long, bloody insurgency. Pro-regime militias, cartels, they have every reason to fight back, hitting U.S. troops and, more importantly, the oil infrastructure. But on the other hand, you have a massive legitimacy crisis. By pushing aside the democratic opposition, the U.S. risks turning the Venezuelan people against them. It starts to look a lot less like a liberation and a lot more like an old-school imperialist resource grab. Which leaves us with the billion-dollar question. Operation Southern Spear was, without a doubt, a bold and decisive move. But did the United States just secure its interests and remove a threat? Or did it just walk straight into its next generation-defining quagmire? To stay ahead of huge geopolitical shifts like this one, make sure you like this explainer and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives. We're going to be tracking this situation very closely as it develops. Thanks for watching.